From the News Channel 5 Network, this is OpenLine.
Hello everyone, welcome to OpenLine, a very distinguished panel tonight. We have three Vanderbilt professors. What we are talking about is the history of protest in the United States, why some of those protests are peaceful and why some of those protests become violent, like what we saw in Baltimore recently. And again, very happy to have with us the distinguished group of guests that we have. I want to introduce them now. Dr. Gilman Whiting, thank you for being with us. Dr. Tiffany Patterson, thank you also for being with us. And Dr. Hector Myers. All Vanderbilt University professors, all teach African American studies and diaspora studies. Is that right? Diaspora?
That's good enough, yes.
And Dr. Myers, you have even more things with your name, health, medicine, and society programs as psychologists. Thank you all for being here. Let's start first. Diaspora studies, African American and diaspora studies. Familiarize us with those. How would you describe that?
The term diaspora actually comes from Jewish history and Greek, and the word it comes from Greek language. It means dispersal. And the presence of African people in the Americas and around the world came with slavery and migration, depending on the period you're studying. So diaspora is the concept we use to signify that these groups of people, whether they live in Brazil or the US or in Cuba or in India, have some connection historically, some cultural connection and oftentimes political connection. And those connections have been forged not only by the history of slavery and migration, it's been forged by the writing, the practice of diaspora, of moving around, and political movements, actually. The Civil Rights Movement, for example, I'm working on a study that shows how the Civil Rights Movement impacted Indian movements in the same period. Gandhi, the story of Gandhi doesn't go just one way. Martin Luther King went that way as well. And so diaspora studies is interdisciplinary. By that I mean that we are trained in traditional disciplines. I am a historian. The chair of the department is a literary scholar. This is an ed-psych, education psychology is his discipline. Professor Myers' course is cross-list with ours, and it's on health disparities. We have a scholar from history who works on Brazil, and so on. So that's diaspora studies. And so we teach courses on the origins of the diaspora, where people went to, what kind of cultures they created, what kind of political experiences shaped their cultural lives and their economic lives. We have courses that deal with the creative production and religion. And so whatever human societies engage in, African people engaged in, and that's what we teach.
Fascinating. And when we talk about protest, the history in the United States, there's a rich history. And we often focus on the violent, but obviously during the Civil Rights Movement, there were many peaceful and very effective protests. And so let's talk about the history. Who wants to take that to kind of set the stage here when we talk about protest in America? Well, good. Let's do that.
Well, let's begin with an understanding of American society that is somewhat at odds with the national narrative of society all about freedom. Well, this society, you cannot understand freedom in America without understanding that it was built on the backs of slaves and slavery. It was fundamental to the making of America. Secondly, America, because of slavery and because of the imperial conquest that early settlers engaged in, was a violent society. We were born in it. So it's not surprising that those who protest against certain structures, protest itself is a mild term. I'm always fascinated with what we call such gatherings. Most of the time, those marches and activities were rebellions rather than protests.
Right.
Okay, but protest is everything from writing a letter to the newspaper to the president. But rebellion is something else again. And when people who are on the bottom of a society, when people who are disenfranchised, if you will, protests against such structures, those that they're protesting against don't like it. So what we saw in the past when those protests when the Civil Rights Movement did turn violent, let's not forget Bull Connor, those white Southerners deeply resented their Negroes, as they would have said it, daring to raise their voices. They were the ones that created the violence. We have a fond saying that the Cold War was very hot because that's where the civil rights began, was during the 1950s. What we saw in Baltimore and Ferguson was a kind of rebellion as well, a rebellion against a pattern of disrespect by an institutional structure, the police department and justice system. The fact that young people, oftentimes, and people's emotions get riled up, got out of control, does not take away from the reality that this was a rebellion. And it turned violent as a result. Some of the same factors created that. But let's be clear, it was not only African Americans who protested against such injustice. The Irish did in the 1870s, in the Chicago race riot and they call it a race riot, but they only call it a race riot when black people are involved. But there were white people involved because they stoned a young boy who crossed the line, a segregated line on Lake Michigan. I grew up in the Chicago area, and this is a well-known story. So it is not possible to have political protests and not run the risk of violence.
When you all were watching Baltimore and last week as this was unfolding, what were you thinking? How tragic was it? And then you heard the mayor, and she's apologized for this, say that those participating are thugs and say some tough things. She was obviously caught up in the heat of the moment, and it had to be terrible for her to witness this. But let me ask, what did you think as you were watching what we're seeing there? There's some pictures on our screen now. What did you think as that was unfolding?
Well, it reminded me very much of many other incidents where people were fighting for their rights and how things can very predictably escalate. One of the problems you have when you have any kind of group movement is as she pointed out, the risk of others coming in who will take advantage of the situation. Sometimes it's because they just simply got caught up in it and they're just angry and can't control their emotions. But other times there are other agendas that get brought in. So you have, for example, in the 1960s, 1970s, I came here from LA. And one of the things that was known in LA was the police COINTELPRO, where they would bring police officers, often African American officers, in as apparent members of the group, and they'd provoke situations. And again, the reason for provoking the situation is to allow the police now to have a legitimate reason to step in and take action. So anytime there is a protest movement, that is always a risk, and that did not surprise me. It's always disappointing when it happens, because it takes the focus off of the real issue and puts it on, well, who was throwing stones, who was doing this. The police now look as victims, as opposed to sometimes the provocateurs, if you will. So it reminds me of here we go again.
Well, exactly. Here we go again. The last time we saw that extent in Baltimore, 1968. Right. And there are people that would say, we've moved beyond that. And here we have Ferguson and then Baltimore. When you saw this in Baltimore, and maybe there are people out there that think we've moved beyond that, what does this indicate?
Well, for me, I hearken back to some of the words that Martin Luther King said around '68, and he said basically that riots are the language of the unheard. And ultimately, we have people who have been already cordoned off for quite some time. We talk about this piling on effect that eventually is going to break the back of any reasonable person. And so when I watched it, I was not at all surprised at what was happening. I was saddened, and I was a little bit worried that at the end of it all, when you count it up, you'll have more people in the community who have been killed. Look, we watched for several years an on-TV program called The Wire. It dealt with Baltimore specifically. It was a blueprint of what was going on in the city. It was real. And from education to healthcare to all of these areas were actually under stress. It's like Katrina in New Orleans before the water hit. there's a ticking space there. You have people cordoned off from the rest of society. You have folks living in food deserts. You have folks. So it's just a matter of time that all of these incidents, because it wasn't just this one young man who was murdered, because we're worried about broken store windows, but we're not talking about broken spines.
Yeah.
And we have to think about that when we say that, and this is not one incident, it's something that piles up. But I also like to throw in here that most of the things that we have on our historical agenda, everything from Gay Pride Day to Stonewall, Seneca Falls, Women's Rights Movement, none of these were peaceful. They were all protests. We have to find distance from these events to actually see what happened. Did it turn the tables in terms of how we deal with policing in communities and all of those issues there? So again, not surprised, a little saddened, but just like in '92 with Rodney King in LA, and just like in '68 with King, and it's just those things that happen, and eventually people just get fed up and they're not heard.
And are you optimistic? Well, we have to take a break, but it sounds like you're saying sometimes it takes something like this to shed light on injustice, and then perhaps, hopefully, it can be addressed. And so are you optimistic, or does it mean there are pockets like this all over the country, and we're going to see more of it? That's what we'll take a break. We'll come back. If you want to call, there's the number, 737+, 737-7587. Take a break. Be back right after this.